A good dog has a few key qualities. Loyal, affectionate, maybe protective. But what if your dog isn't keeping you from danger? What if your dog is the danger? Now, I'm not talking about an aggressive canine. In fact, I'm not really talking about dogs at all. You see, there are strange things out there that can take the shape of something we find harmless, like man's so-called best friend, and prey on our trust. A wolf in dog's clothing, so to speak, which is exactly what we encountered last week. But in today's episode, the second half of our story, we'll come face to face with the wolf in question. But first, let me remind you how it all started. I heard this story from my friend Lee, a camera operator I'd met on set. Years before, he was just a 16-year-old kid spending summers on his grandpa's dude ranch in Navajo land. That's where he met Jaya and Todd. The married couple came to the ranch for some fresh air, but they left with a souvenir. A mysterious stray dog Todd affectionately named Salty. That dog wasn't just a dog. It was something false and foul. A kind of evil two outsiders on native land couldn't understand. And they bought it from the desert and set it loose in an idyllic new home, suburban Maine. But it wasn't until their neighbor's cat showed up dead, and then the neighbor too, that Jaya felt something terrifying was responsible. Something she couldn't explain. And if her fears were true, it was living in her house. You're listening to Run, Fool! I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 30, Skinwalkers, Part 2. The week after Mrs. Ingman's murder, Jaya was still reeling. Jaya could still see the two knitting needles stabbed through each of the old woman's eye sockets, her jaw open in a scream no one heard. But Todd acted as if there hadn't been a grisly murder next door. That Saturday, he whistled show tunes as he flipped pancakes. Out the kitchen window, crime scene tape fluttered in the autumn breeze on Mrs. Ingman's lawn. Todd ate his breakfast and scratched Salty's ears. The dog licked his hand and peered up at Jaya, watching her with his pale green eyes. Jaya looked away. Since Mrs. Ingman's murder, she'd felt even more uneasy around Salty. But she knew better than to tell Todd. What would she even say? Hey, babe, I have the inexplicable feeling our dog may have committed a heinous murder that required opposable thumbs. No, whatever happened to Mrs. Ingman wasn't the work of a canine. Plus, Todd already thought she was paranoid. Jaya didn't need to add crazy to the list. So she swallowed her suspicion, pasted on a smile. It was fine. Everything was fine. Later that day, she forced herself to join Salty and Todd on their evening walk to the cemetery. Ever since Salty spooked the other pups at the dog park, they started taking him there to roam. It was hard for your creepy dog to freak anyone out when everyone was dead. But this time, the place wasn't empty. The cemetery gate was swarming with cops. Jaya squinted. What's going on now? She muttered. Todd shook his head. I don't know. I'm going to find out. Jaya watched Todd stroll up to a stocky officer and do his best impression of a concerned citizen. Then shook the officer's hand and headed back. You're not going to believe what he told me, Todd hissed. They're investigating grave robberies, a bunch of them. Jaya's mouth dropped. Like missing jewelry? No, Jay, Todd said. Like body theft. Someone is digging up graves and taking the corpses. The next morning, while Todd slept in, Jaya eased her anxiety with a good old cleansing rampage. She tidied the kitchen from Todd's pancake breakfast. How one man dirtied so many dishes she never knew. And then she cleaned the fireplace. She was halfway through when she noticed Salty watching her. Jaya tried to ignore him, focused instead on a stubborn patch of soot. She groaned, grabbing the fire poker from the rack, and lodged it loose. When she turned around to set it down, Salty growled. It was the first noise he'd made in months, a low guttural sound, lower than she'd expected from a dog his size. Jaya froze, half from fear, half from pure surprise, when Salty lunged. She screamed, moving so quickly she didn't realize what she was doing until she heard the dull thud of the iron as it made impact with Salty's body. Suddenly, Todd was in the doorway. A horrified look etched onto his face. Jaya's stomach dropped, and so did the poker, landing with a clatter on the tile. An hour later, they sat under the glaring fluorescence of the animal hospital. The veterinarian, Dr. Hall, squinted through her glasses. As she examined Salty, her long gray hair fastened into a braid. Finally, she stood up. No broken bones, no concussion. If anything, he's got a nasty bruise. Todd sighed in relief. What was it that struck him again? Jaya looked at Todd, but he avoided her gaze. She took a breath. I did, she confessed. He was growling and about to lunge, or at least I swore he was. Jaya was beginning to doubt what really happened. She tried explaining to Todd it was self-defense, but all he saw was his wife hitting their dog, with a weapon no less. She felt horrible. Dr. Hall nodded. Sometimes when we perceive a threat, instincts kick in, just like any animal. She gave Salty a pat. Where did you say you adopted him? Todd explained how they found Salty on the ranch in Arizona 2 months before, but they didn't know much else. He's very unusual looking, Dr. Hall commented. He's obviously some kind of desert mutt, possibly a coyote hybrid. We don't get a lot of those in Maine. She squinted at Salty, thinking. He sat down and stared right back. Whatever he is, he's smart as shit, I can tell you that. They finished the exam with some routine blood work, and Todd took Salty out to the car. But before Jaya followed, Dr. Hall stopped her. I can tell you're worried about his behavior, she said softly. My best advice is to listen to your gut. But if you don't feel safe, give me a call. On the way home, they sat in silence. Jaya went to take Todd's hand, but he pulled away, his eyes trained on the road. I don't know what's come over you, Jaya, but this paranoia has gone too far. Jaya's head was swirling again with words she didn't dare say. So instead, she apologized. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm just scared. Todd looked at her with an empty expression. He felt 1,000,000 miles away. That's the problem, he muttered. There's nothing to be scared of. The rest of the week, Todd and Jaya hardly spoke. She began to worry. Were they headed for divorce? Over a dog? It seemed crazy. Weeks ago, they were happy. Then, that Friday, Todd left town. Every autumn, he went pheasant hunting with his brothers back in Minnesota. It was a sport Jaya didn't pretend to understand. She was still getting used to the rifle Todd kept in the house. But soon, he and the gun would be gone, and it'd be just Jaya and Salty. She was dreading it more than anything. The evening Todd left, it was storming. He said goodbye at the door, his rifle and duffel bag in tow, scratched Salty's ears. Be a good boy, cooed. Jaya watched on, nervous. Please keep your phone on you, all right? Todd gave her a weak smile. I will, but everything's going to be okay. Then he was gone. When Jaya turned around, Salty was watching her, as always. Guess it's just me and you, huh, buddy? The words felt disingenuous, and she swore Salty knew. He was getting in her head already. So what do you want? Food? He didn't react. You want to go out? She asked desperately. But Salty kept watching. Suddenly, a flash lit up the dim entryway, followed by a crack of thunder. Then, the house was plunged into darkness. Shit, Jaya muttered. She stood and peered out the window. The whole neighborhood lost power. She picked her way through the dark house to retrieve a flashlight, but the beam was weak. She sighed. She could make a fire, but after the incident with the fireplace, she decided against it. That's when she realized, where's the dog? Salty? Jaya called out. She strained her ears and heard the faint jingle of his collar echoing in the house. She looked from place to place, aiming her flashlight into the dark. But with each empty room, she felt her chest grow tighter. Was she scared she'd lost him? No, that was impossible. The house was locked. Then she realized she was afraid he was still there. Jaya gripped her flashlight tighter. Salty? Come back, buddy. Jaya could hear the fear in her voice. She stood on the staircase listening again for his collar. Thunder rumbled in the distance. And then she heard a voice. Jaya. She froze, skin prickling. It was deep and unfamiliar. Her heart began to pound. Hello, Jaya. It almost sang this time, mocking her. Jaya whipped around. It was like it was everywhere. Then there was a long, low squeal, like something sharp dragging against glass. She turned slowly toward the living room. Standing by the bay windows was a shadowy figure. It was unnaturally tall and thin, and though its shape was human, there was something feral in its pose. It stood perfectly still, but full of tension, like the moment before a predator strikes. But lightning did instead. The room flashed with blinding light. Jaya gasped. Backlit by the window, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of antlers branching from the figure's misshapen head. Its eyes, two glowing orbs peering from the dark. A nocturnal animal with its gaze trained on Jaya. The light lasted an instant, but before it was over, Jaya turned and ran. She sprinted up the stairs and locked herself in the bedroom, but Jaya wasn't stupid. That thing was huge, so she pushed her dresser to barricade the door, then a chest and a chair for good measure. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called Todd.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
He went to voicemail. Jaya left him a panicked message. Please pick up. There's something in our house. She was beginning to hyperventilate now. She dialed 911 when her screen went black. She'd run out of battery. No, she begged. She raced to plug the phone in, but you already know. The power was out. Jaya was screwed. She didn't sleep that night. Jaya spent the hours with the curtains drawn, staring at the barricaded door. The thing never came, but morning did. As sunlight filtered through the curtains, Jaya looked over at her alarm clock, flashing with the wrong numbers. The power was back. That's when she remembered her phone. Jaya picked up her cell and nearly cried in relief as it rebooted. She'd missed 4 voicemails, 3 from Todd and 1 from the emergency vet clinic. Jaya hit play, and the doctor's voice came through the phone.
This is Dr. Holt from New England Animal Emergency. I received the results of Salty's blood work, and they were very concerning. I'd like you to bring him in to retest, just so we can ensure there's been no kind of error, because, well...
The vet trailed off, her voice lower.
The properties were inconsistent with canine blood. To put it plainly, this sample is from a species I've never seen. So please, call me back.
Jaya dropped the phone. There was something wrong with Salty. She hadn't let herself believe how wrong he was, but she'd known. She'd known since the beginning. Jaya shot to her feet and began rifling through the room looking for something. She dug in the nightstands, the dresser, and finally she found it tucked inside her suitcase. It was a postcard for Woody's Navajo Dude Ranch. On the back, scrawled in messy teen boy handwriting, was a phone number. That's right, my friend Lee's phone number. He'd given it to them right before they took Salty from the ranch. Be safe, he told them. Jaya found it strange then, but now was obvious. He knew. Jaya dialed Lee's number. It rang and rang. Then finally, he picked up. Lee was exactly like she remembered, the polite kid who said less than he meant. But as soon as she mentioned the dog, he changed. There was a long pause. If you're calling me, I think you already know. That dog you found isn't a dog. Fear creeped into Lee's voice. We call it Ye Nal Delushi. It means, with it. Lee paused. But in your language, they're called Skinwalkers. Jaya's neck prickled at the word, and as soon as he'd said it, Lee was noticeably anxious. He said he shouldn't be talking about this. Skinwalkers were something unspeakable, and he'd only heard so much. But he would tell Jaya everything he knew. What Lee said next was a whirlwind of information, most of which, as I mentioned, is taboo in Navajo culture. So out of respect, I'm not going to tell you anything you can't Google yourself. Skinwalkers, Lee explained, were once human practitioners of spiritual magic, community healers who would sacrifice their humanity for a darker, more potent power. How does someone give up their humanity, you ask? The answer is by committing an unspeakable deed, an act of true evil. Usually by killing a family member. In exchange, they gain a host of abilities, mind reading for one, and of course, shapeshifting. Skinwalkers can disguise themselves as anything, but most take the form of a predatory animal. And in Jaya's case, a creepy, green-eyed, coyote-ass-looking canine. The same feral dog that had been haunting their reservation for years. Once it showed up, strange things happened. Some so awful, Lee's grandfather refused to speak of them. Lee told Jaya Skinwalkers could summon plagues, wipe out crops, and even ruin relationships. Jaya thought of her own troubled marriage. The arguments, the tension, it was no coincidence. She and Todd had been manipulated like puppets. Lee continued. He described how a Skinwalker's wickedness grew like a parasite that fed on suffering. And if they remained too long in their animal state, they'd no longer be able to take human form. The result was a corrupted hybrid. Not animal, not quite human. A monstrous body as foul as their souls. Lee went quiet for a moment. I wanted to warn you about the dog, but my grandpa... Lee paused, his voice full of shame. It's forbidden to tell outsiders about Skinwalkers. He wouldn't allow me, so I let you take it. I had to. But now you know, and I'm going to help you get rid of it. Leah explained to Jaya that all Skinwalkers had a secret place where they performed dark rituals. It may be on her property, but she would know it when she saw it. If she sabotaged his hiding place, she could weaken it. But how do I kill it? Jaya asked. You can use a blade, Lee answered, but it must be coated in white ash. Jaya thought of the fireplace. Suddenly she realized Salty only turned on her when she was holding the poker covered in ash. Lee's voice snapped her back to the present. And Jaya, be careful. Once it knows you know, you're not safe. Jaya barricaded her bedroom door. Then, with a pounding heart, she cracked it open. With no sign of Salty, she snuck downstairs. The first thing she did was grab the fire poker and coated the iron in ash. Now armed, she had to find this secret lair. There were only a few places it could be. She started in the basement. They never went down there. Though the rest of the house was renovated, the basement revealed the home's true age. It was dusty with low ceilings and stone floors. Jaya stepped quietly down the narrow stairs, but every other step creaked. She held her breath until she reached the bottom and scanned the space. She looked behind boxes, in the room with the water heater. Then her eyes landed on a small wooden door in the far corner, the old root cellar. Jaya pushed open the decaying wood and pulled on the light. The bare bulb swung overhead, casting strange shadows across the tiny space. As it steadied, Jaya gagged. The room was covered in bones, human bones, and the animal parts were arranged in intricate patterns. Suddenly, she knew. The grave robberies, the missing corpses at the cemetery, It was all Salty. And there, lying among the refuse, was the rotting, headless body of a cat, Bella. The poor feline was there too, but worst of all was what lay beside her. 2 red-white gelatinous globs oozed onto the floor. Mrs. Ingman's harpooned eyeballs. Jaya stifled a scream when she heard heavy footsteps from upstairs. The ceiling rained dust as they moved across the floor above. Her heart pounded in her ears when the steps stopped. Jaya grabbed the fire poker and fished her cell phone from her pocket. She didn't know who she would call, but it felt good in her hand, like a lifeline. She held her breath and waited for the steps to continue, but it was silent. Finally, she breathed. Jaya? Jaya jumped and whipped around. Standing in the cellar doorway was Todd. "Oh, thank God," she gasped. Her husband looked at her, his face a mix of confusion and concern. Jaya stuttered. You're home early. How did you—" "I got your voicemail," Todd said. "I booked the first ticket back." "Are you okay? What's going on?" Jaya was at a loss for words. "Todd, I need you to listen to me about Salty. I called Lee from the ranch in Arizona." Todd raised his eyebrows. "The Navajo kid?" Jaya nodded. "He told me things about Salty, things that are hard to believe. But look," Jaya pointed into the horrific room. "He did this." Todd took it all in and grabbed Jaya's hand. "You're right, Jay. There is something wrong with Salty." He looked her in her eyes. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you." Jaya felt relief wash over her. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "What did the Navajo kid tell you?" Jaya paused, suddenly feeling uneasy. "He told me Salty isn't a dog. He's a person turned into a monster disguised as a dog. They call them Skinwalkers." Todd froze, his expression unreadable. "That sounds terrifying," he muttered. Jaya nodded. Todd pulled her to him and tilted her chin to look up at him. "I'm just glad you're safe, Jay." Then he kissed her. His motions were fast, feverish. In seconds, his tongue was in Jaya's mouth, and her arms pinned at her sides. The iron poker clattered to the ground. Jaya pulled away, but Todd's grip was like a vice. He was too strong. "You're hurting me," she insisted, but he didn't let go. His mouth moved to her ear. His breath felt like flames licking her skin.
"You know, the kid shouldn't have told you all that."
Jaya froze. His voice sounded different, lower.
"It's taboo, you know."
Todd's words descended into a growl.
"Unspeakable."
Jaya glanced down. Blue veins bloomed underneath Todd's skin, spreading up his arm. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The fire iron. She dropped the fire iron, but the cell phone was still in her hand. Jaya's fingers struggled to move. She couldn't dial the police, but she did manage to press call on her most recent contact, Lee. Todd, or the thing pretending to be Todd, cackled and shoved Jaya into the stone wall. She crumpled, and the cell phone skidded across the floor. What Jaya saw sapped the air from her lungs. In the dim basement light, she watched as her husband's shape distorted. Bones popped from their sockets as his limbs stretched to unnatural lengths. His shoulders sprouted tufts of mangy fur on naked skin, and his hands became deformed paws. Massive antlers crackled as they branched from a misshapen skull. But the worst was its eyes. They were Salty's eyes, those same haunting pale green. They peered out from its monstrous head, like eyes from a mask. A human encased in the body of a beast.
"Hello, Jaya,"
the Skinwalker crooned. Its voice filled the cold basement like a deranged chorus.
"How does it feel to be face to face? You've been denying my existence so long, choking down your own intuition."
Jaya rushed for the stairs, but the Skinwalker stepped in her path and walked toward her. Its body jerked as it moved. each muscle visible beneath the stretched skin. Jaya's chest heaved with panic as it crouched over her.
What was it that damn veterinarian said? That's right. Trust your gut.
Tears filled Jaya's eyes. Somewhere, folded in the panic and the terror, she felt shame. The Skinwalker smiled at her, revealing glistening black gums and long fangs.
Well, Jaya, if you don't trust it, maybe you don't deserve one.
The beast lunged, plunging its sharp claws into her gut. Jaya screamed in agony. It was the loudest sound she'd ever made. Everything, the pain, the fear, the doubt, the knowing, everything she'd bottled up came pouring out in one awful wail. And then, as the Skinwalker sliced her open, so did everything else. Gore gushed from Jaya's stomach as she was disemboweled, finally fading with her screams. She went limp, her consciousness dwindling, when she heard a voice from somewhere in the house. Suddenly, standing at the bottom of the stairs, hunting rifle in hand, was Todd. The real Todd. Her Todd. He rushed to Jaya, sinking to his knees. "Oh God," he wailed. "Oh God, Jay, what happened?" Jaya opened her mouth to warn him, but all that came out was a rasping breath. "It's okay, baby," he muttered. "Stay with me. I'm here." Jaya's eyes widened as she watched the Skinwalker emerge behind Todd. It silently changed shape, shrinking onto all fours. Seeing the fear in her eyes, Todd turned around to see Salty, covered in blood. The dog that was not a dog sat in front of him. Todd stood, creating a barrier between Jaya and Salty, and raised his shotgun. But as Todd cocked his rifle, Salty cocked his head and whimpered. Jaya watched as Todd's finger hovered on the trigger, his face a clash of emotions. Then Salty spoke.
"Oh, Todd, have I been a bad boy? Maybe now you learn not everything's what it seems."
Todd's eyes widened in horror as Salty's canine body stretched. As the monster unfurled to its full height, Todd finally pulled the trigger. The bullet caught the Skinwalker in the shoulder, but it just laughed its deep cackle and lunged. The Skinwalker sank its canines into Todd and ripped out his throat. Blood gurgled from his gaping neck, and Todd collapsed to the floor. The Skinwalker stepped over their bodies, and Jaya heard the groan of the basement staircase. The monster was gone. Next to her, Todd was barely alive. The stream of blood from his wound slowing to a trickle. With the last of her strength, she reached out her hand until she could graze her fingertips against his. They held each other's gaze as their consciousnesses faded. But as everything grew dark, the basement was consumed in burning light. The last thing Jaya saw was her husband's face, bathed in the orange-red glow. She never loved him more. That phone call was the last Lee ever heard from Jaya. When he answered and no one replied, he almost hung up. That is, until he heard her screams. Lee listened to everything in shock. By the time he ended the call to dial 911, he realized he didn't know what city Jaya and Todd lived in, much less their address. So he called Jaya back, but it went straight to voicemail.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed.
That's when he knew he was too late. It wasn't until a month later that he got up the courage to Google her. The first result was exactly what he feared. An article from a local newspaper headlined, "Couple Dead in Mysterious House Fire." Lee didn't have to read it to know that wasn't how Jaya and Todd met their end. He'd heard the truth. But he scanned the article anyway when he landed on a line that turned his blood cold. It read, "Miraculously, first responders recovered the resident's pet dog, unscathed. The dog was sent to East Maine Humane Society, where it will soon be available for adoption." Lee finished telling me his story over coffee. Our conversations had started from the lunch tents on set to the crew parking lot and now a little cafe in Thailand. He'd had me wrapped, but when he finally reached the end, I found myself nodding. His story was horrifying, but it also confirmed a suspicion I'd had all along. To open your trust to anyone you didn't truly know, human or animal, was to render yourself vulnerable in the most dangerous way, just like Jaya and Todd and the poor fools who adopted Salty after them. Lee shook his head. I got it all wrong, he said. You couldn't live life terrified to let in the unknown. Instead, you had to trust yourself. Listen to your instincts. If you did, you'd know the difference between friend and foe, or an innocent stray and a bloodthirsty shapeshifter. Plus, Lee smiled, we just met. What makes you so sure I'm not a skinwalker? He had a point. After that show wrapped, we remained friends long after, and I'm happy to report he's still human. And recently, when my daughter begged me for a dog, I buckled and adopted a rescue. Not a purebred or a puppy, but a genuine mutt straight from the pound. Skinwalkers be damned. But I'm glad I have Lee's number, just in case. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Alex Garland and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Editing by Abakar Adan. It was sound designed and mixed by Greg Devins II. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Creature vocalization by Terry Cashburn and artwork by Jessica Clarkston Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.